I'm Dr. Louise, and this is Dr. Louise Thinks, a channel dedicated to helping everyday folks connect with the healing power of philosophy. Have you ever felt like hoping is hurting you more than helping you? It's a question I've been asking myself a lot lately. As we're heading into the holiday season and the world might be feeling a bit heavy, there's a lot going on, it's more important than ever that we think critically about ourselves and what we're hoping for. In this video, we're going to continue our discussion about the philosophy of hope, and we're going to ask what it means to hope well. How can we make sure that our hopes are truly serving us and not making our lives harder? And critically, how do we build a kind of hope that helps us sustain our actions, especially when the odds are stacked against us? In exploring the relationship between hope and oppression, Dr. Katie Stockdale explores what it might mean to hope well. She pulls on and expands on the work of another philosopher named McGeer. McGeer argues that hoping well requires developing a certain kind of hope, something called responsive hope. Responsive hope means that us as agents are able to shift the target of our hope when the world appears resistant to bringing about the outcome that we're seeking. Importantly, rather than a narrow focus on just the outcome, we are putting our energy towards creating a state that is meaningful and valuable to each of us. To see how this works, let's consider the hope that racial oppression will end. Now, it looks like this outcome has a very low probability of ever coming to pass. And if we are focusing our hope on achieving this outcome, it seems very likely that we're going to feel frustrated and we're going to really struggle when we face the inevitable setbacks of this kind of project. However, if we focus less on the speed at which we're achieving the target and instead focus on the fact that bringing about this kind of outcome is meaningful and valuable to us, we are less likely to feel those kinds of frustrations. So hoping well in this kind of case means acknowledging that this outcome is very unlikely to come to pass, while also recognizing that it is meaningful and valuable for us to work toward this end. This is what it means to have responsive hope. We've shifted the target of our hope from the completion of the goal to participating in a meaningful state. Now, an interesting aspect of focusing on what is meaningful and valuable to us, rather than just focusing on the intended outcome of a hope, is that we really do need to hope well in community. In other words, if we want to really connect to the stuff that's meaningful and valuable to us, we need to be interacting with what McGeer calls the responsive other, who supports our hopeful struggle. This means that if we really want to hope well, we absolutely need to do it in community. This is really important when we're trying to keep hope alive, when we're in situations where the outcomes we're seeking are very unlikely to happen. So, okay, let's say we want to hope well. We're into this idea of shifting to what is meaningful and valuable, but what does it actually look like to be in community and hoping well? Stockdale gives us some specific examples to help us understand what this process actually looks like. Sometimes we really just need to talk about our hopes in order to feel connected to them. Sometimes we need to talk about them in order to navigate the very real possibility that the outcome we're seeking may never come to pass. This means communicating with the people in our community to practice articulating our hopes, brainstorming ways we might actually be able to execute those hopes. And importantly, we need to be in community to explicitly identify what really is meaningful and valuable about this pursuit of this hope. An important part of being in community with our hopes is that we work together, not only to articulate whatever goals may fall out from our hopes, but also that we are finding ways to pursue our hopes that directly support our sense of agency. In our last video, we talked about the role agency has to play when it comes to hope, especially for folks who are experiencing oppression. This feeling that we can actually bring about change is critical to our hope, but it's also often very difficult for people who are being systematically oppressed. On this view, in order to hope well, we really do need our peers to help us talk through how we can pursue our hopes while also connecting with our sense of agency. Now, Stockdale's picture of hoping well includes all of this kind of supportive work where we're helping each other out, developing our hopes, but it also involves sometimes challenging each other's hopes. She argues that some hopes are actually quite problematic, and sometimes we need our community to help us navigate those kind of hopes. This naturally leads to the question, how do we know what kinds of hopes are problematic and which ones aren't? Stockdale provides us a framework for how to evaluate hopes in order to help us with this project. She argues that there are 4 different modes we can use when evaluating hope. These are epistemic, practical rationality, fittingness, and moral appropriateness. So let's talk about each one of those and how we might apply it to hope. So number 1, the epistemic criteria. The epistemic criteria involves determining whether the outcome that you're hoping for can actually be realized given the way the world really is, and if the probability that you're attributing to that outcome actually matches the way the world is. So here we're going to be looking at all the available evidence for whether this outcome is going to occur, and we're kind of making sure that your hope is matching all of that evidence. So let's say that you have a hope that one day pigs can fly. And let's just say that you really think this is going to happen. You think it's really likely that one day pigs will fly. So when we're evaluating that hope in terms of the epistemic criteria, we have to look at some facts about pigs. It turns out pigs don't have wings right now, and they are generally not shaped in a way that is well suited to flying. So it's looking like pigs would have to evolve a lot in order to get towards any kind of being that could fly. So the pigs are lacking the mechanisms necessary to fly, and it's a pretty low probability that they're going to be able to evolve in a way where that's going to happen anytime in the foreseeable future. So the probability of this outcome is very low, maybe even 0. So this hope that someday pigs will fly is failing the epistemic criteria. It looks like this outcome is not possible, and it has an extremely low probability where your hope is giving it a very high probability. So that's a failure on the epistemic criteria. So now that we kind of understand the epistemic criteria, let's move on to the next one. That is the criteria of practical rationality. Now, in its simplest form, this is a criteria that's helping us think about whether this hope can actually help us do something. That's what the practical is referring to. Sometimes we also say prudential. Practical and prudential are kind of synonyms in this case. So we might ask ourselves questions about the hope, like, does maintaining this hope actually help us to take the actions necessary to bring about the change? If it does, then, well, that's a good practical reason to maintain the hope. Another thing we might ask is, does having this hope actually improve our overall sense of well-being? These are kind of like mental health reasons you might have in order to maintain the hope. If it's actually helping us improve that part of our life experience, then that's another good reason to keep that hope. So here we're asking ourselves, what are the practical benefits of holding on to this hope? Let's return to the hope that someday pigs can fly. Let's just say that I love pigs, and the idea of them flying just brings me so much joy. I laugh about it every time I think about it. And it's just something that makes me legitimately happy. A practical benefit of this hope might be that I have improved my overall sense of well-being. I maybe don't have a lot of things in my life that make me that happy in the way imagining pigs flying makes me happy. So maintaining this hope might actually be doing a positive thing for my mental health, in which case this is going to pass the practical rationality criteria for Stockdale. Okay, so we've done the epistemic criteria, we've done the practical rationality criteria. Now we're going to talk about the fittingness criteria. This is a criteria that's used in lots of different contexts when we're talking about the philosophy of emotions. Whether an emotion like hope is fitting or not depends on whether that emotion correctly represents their objects as having certain evaluative features. That's a lot of big words, so let's just dive into it a bit more. It'll make more sense. So usually when we're talking about fitting, we have two different ways we discuss it. We talk about fittingness in terms of size and fittingness in terms of shape. Let's talk about shape first. So an emotion is fit in terms of size if the emotion's object really does have the properties that the emotion represents it as having. So let's consider an example. Let's say you have a friend who has a Nintendo Switch. And let's say you right now don't have a Switch, and you believe it'd be really good for you to have a Nintendo Switch. In this case, it would be fitting for you in terms of size to feel envy towards your friend who has the Nintendo Switch. When we look at the real world situation, you not having a Switch and your friend having a Switch, and we look at when it makes sense to envy someone, we see that these two go together. They fit. So that was shape. Let's talk about size now. An emotion is fit in terms of size if the strength of the emotion is felt to an appropriate degree, given the context in question. Let's return to the Switch example. But this time, let's say you haven't been able to play video games in a really long time, and you know that if you did play them, you would feel so good, and it would just be an amazing experience for you. In other words, it would be extremely good for you to have a Switch. In this case, it would be fitting in terms of size that you are extremely envious of your friend. The strength of that emotion matches the facts of the situation. Let's switch up the situation again. Let's say that you are feeling strongly envious of your friend, but when we look at the facts of the situation, if you had a Switch, it probably wouldn't make that big a difference in your life. Maybe you'd play it a couple times, but it wouldn't really matter that much. In this situation, your strong envy is a bad fit. It does not fit well with the facts of the situation. In other words, that strong envy in that case is a bad fit in terms of size for the facts. So now we have a sense of the epistemic criteria, the practical rationality criteria, and the fittingness criteria. Remember, we talked about fittingness in terms of shape and size. Now we're ready to talk about the last criteria that Stockdale gives us to help us evaluate each other's hopes. This is the moral appropriateness of the hope. Now, according to Stockdale, we might have hopes that pass the three other criteria. So it looks like they pass the epistemic criteria, it's practically rational, and it is fitting, but it might still not be morally appropriate. Here's an example Stockdale uses. Consider Susie. Susie has recently broken up with her partner, and her former partner is engaged to someone. And let's say that Susie is hoping that her former partner's new marriage is a complete failure, that it's a total disaster for them, and she's hoping all of this bad stuff happens as a result of this new marriage. Now, Stockdale's gonna say this hope of Susie's passes the three initial criteria. So epistemically, it makes sense, practically, it makes sense, and it is a good fit in terms of the facts of the situation. However, Stockdale thinks it fails the moral appropriateness criteria. In other words, it is morally inappropriate for Susie to hope that her ex's new marriage is a total failure. And it is also morally wrong for Susie to act on that hope. Stockdale explains this further by saying that there is a moral constraint on hope. It turns out that, at least for some of our hopes, specifically the ones that have moral content, they can reflect well or poorly on a person's character. These kind of hopes can reveal important information about who we are. Because of this, the moral constraint on hope is that when we find ourselves with these morally inappropriate hopes, we have decisive reason to overcome those hopes. According to Stockdale, a morally appropriate hope is one that reveals the character of the agent is properly oriented toward the good, or toward what is morally good. Consider a person who hopes that anti-queer legislature is going to be passed in their local government. This hope is constituted by a desire that threatens the moral rights of queer people. Because it is morally wrong to limit the basic rights of other human beings, this hope is also morally inappropriate. And this is true even if the person doesn't actually take any action to ensure the passing of the legislation. Simply having the hope is enough to reveal that this person is not properly oriented toward the morally good. Stockdale does point out that there's a lot of different reasons that we might hope for the things that we hope for. We don't always have full control over every aspect of our hopes. To some extent, our hopes are influenced by the various social, economic, and political contexts we find ourselves in. Having said all of that, that does not mean we have no control over our hopes, though. We have to accept and retrain ourselves to have hopes that support our ability to develop moral characters that are properly oriented toward what is morally good. For example, a shop owner may hope that a black person entering their store does not steal anything. This hope reveals a defect in the white shop owner's moral character. It's not the case that the shop owner is desiring a morally bad outcome. It's of course good that nothing gets stolen, but nevertheless, the hope is still problematic. This is because the hope is based on this idea that black people are more likely to commit crimes than non-black people. This is something that this white shop owner would need to recognize in themselves and work on improving. Stockdale says, inasmuch as our desires and emotions can change in response to our efforts, they are things for which we can be held to some extent morally responsible. So if it's at least possible for me to know that my emotion might be morally inappropriate, such that I could be responsive to moral reasons to relinquish that emotion or revise that emotion, and I fail to take responsibility to do that work, then that failure is morally blameworthy. This means that when we're evaluating hopes along the moral appropriateness criteria, we will sometimes have to hold people accountable for their morally inappropriate hopes. On the flip side, we may at times need to praise people for their morally appropriate hopes as well. These kind of praiseworthy hopes are really important and valuable because they tend to supplement the person who's hoping's commitments to their moral ends. These are helping hopes that make it easier for people to keep showing up and doing the work that's necessary, even in light of the predictable setbacks that are going to happen when we're working towards hopes that are engaged in justice and these sorts of things. So, in order to hope well, we have to do so in community. That community is going to consist of people who can help us both challenge as well as support our hopes. We can help each other do this by working together to evaluate our hopes along the 4 criteria that Stockdale gave us. As the epistemic criteria, the practical rationality criteria, the fittingness criteria, and importantly, the moral appropriateness criteria. This framework gives us ways that we can lean into the hopes that are supporting us and let go of the hopes that might be hurting us. And especially let go of those hopes that might be morally problematic. In philosophical counseling, one of the important kinds of things we can do is evaluate our hopes. On our own, we don't always take the time to ask ourselves whether our hopes really are serving us and whether they really do align with our values. But when we do that work, we often find a sense of relief, a sense of clarity. This is a very important, powerful thing for us to do. If today's discussion resonated with you, I invite you to think about how you might hope differently. Maybe with more intention, more alignment to your values, and more connection to your community. This kind of exploration is at the heart of what I do in philosophical counseling, helping people navigate the complexities of their inner lives to foster well-being, growth, and meaningful action. Next time, we're going to continue our conversation about the philosophy of hope by looking at the relationship between hope and anger. Together, we're going to examine the value of anger in context of hope and oppression, and how anger can actually fuel meaningful action while remaining tied to hope. It's a powerful connection that's really going to deepen our understanding of what it means to hope well. If you're looking for more tools like this, I want to invite you to join my email list. It's where I share exclusive reflections, resources, and deeper dives into these topics. You'll find all the information in the doobly-doo below. And if you haven't yet, be sure to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell. And until next time, stay curious, be thoughtful, and keep asking those questions. Bye-bye.